People always say the truth will set you free, but nobody ever tells you how terrifying it feels when the truth belongs to the person you trust more than anyone else. If someone had asked me to describe Ethan Carter a week before everything changed, I would have called him my best friend without thinking twice. I would have said he was the kind of person who remembered birthdays without reminders, who showed up whenever someone needed help, and who somehow managed to make every bad day feel a little lighter with nothing more than a crooked smile and a terrible joke. I never would have imagined that one ordinary weekend would completely rewrite the story I thought I had been living for the past 15 years. My name is Noah Brooks, and I grew up in Cedar Ridge, a quiet mountain town in northern Oregon where everybody knew everybody else. Ethan and I met in 5th grade after I accidentally hit him in the face with a baseball during recess. Instead of getting angry, he laughed through a bloody nose and asked if I wanted to play another game after school. That was Ethan. He found reasons to smile where most people found excuses to complain. Somehow, one afternoon turned into 15 years of friendship. We survived awkward teenage years, first jobs, broken relationships, family losses, long road trips, football games, and countless weekends exploring the forests surrounding our hometown. People often joke that we spent more time together than most brothers. We always laughed because it seemed easier than explaining something that had never needed an explanation. He was simply my best friend, or at least that was what I believed. 3 weeks before our annual hiking trip, Ethan told me he had accepted an engineering position in Seattle. It was the kind of opportunity people waited years to receive, complete with better pay, exciting projects, and a fresh start. I congratulated him immediately because I genuinely wanted him to succeed. Yet the moment I drove home that evening, an uncomfortable emptiness settled somewhere deep inside my chest. I convinced myself it was only because my closest friend was moving nearly 300 miles away. That explanation sounded reasonable enough that I never questioned it. A few days later, Ethan called with an idea. "One last hike before I leave," he said. Same tradition, same mountains. I smiled before he even finished the sentence. Every major turning point in our lives had somehow included a hiking trip. We celebrated graduations on mountain trails, escaped stressful weeks by disappearing into the woods, and solved more problems while walking beneath towering Douglas fir trees than we ever had sitting across restaurant tables. Saying yes felt automatic. Saturday morning arrived cool and clear. Ethan pulled into my driveway driving his familiar blue pickup truck with classic rock playing softly through the open windows. He leaned across the passenger seat and grinned the moment I stepped outside carrying my backpack. "You packed enough snacks this time?" he asked with a laugh. "Unlike somebody," I answered. "I actually learned from my mistakes." He laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from the corners of his eyes before shifting the truck into gear. The highway gradually gave way to winding mountain roads lined with endless evergreen forests, and the farther we drove, the quieter the world became. We talked about everything except the one subject waiting between us: his move. Every time the conversation drifted toward Seattle, one of us found another topic instead. Looking back now, I think we were both avoiding a goodbye neither of us was ready to face. Nearly 2 hours later, we reached the Pine Hollow trailhead. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall trees. Birds called somewhere beyond the parking lot, and the crisp scent of pine filled the cool mountain air. Ethan stepped out of the truck, stretched his arms toward the bright blue sky, and smiled with an expression I could not quite understand. It looked hopeful, but there was something quietly bittersweet hidden beneath it. He slung his backpack over one shoulder, looked toward the trail disappearing into the forest, then turned back to me with the same familiar smile that had been part of my life for half of it. "Come on," he said softly. "I have a feeling this is going to be a trip neither of us will ever forget." The trail welcomed us with the familiar peace that had always drawn us back year after year. Towering Douglas firs stretched high above our heads, their branches weaving together until sunlight filtered through in soft golden ribbons that danced across the forest floor. The cool mountain air carried the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and wildflowers blooming somewhere beyond the winding trail. Ethan walked a few steps ahead of me with his backpack resting comfortably on his shoulders, occasionally stopping to point toward an unusual tree or a distant mountain ridge as though he had suddenly become a professional hiking guide. I laughed every time he confidently announced where something was because we both knew his sense of direction had always been questionable. You know, I teased. If we ever get lost out here, I am definitely. For the first half hour, nothing felt unusual. The narrow trail wound peacefully through towering evergreens while soft beams of afternoon sunlight filtered between the branches, painting shifting patterns across the moss-covered ground. Ethan remained convinced we were heading toward the hidden waterfall marked on his aging trail map, and I had no reason to doubt him. We had spent years exploring these mountains together, and although he liked to joke about his questionable sense of direction, we had always managed to find our way home before sunset. The forest felt familiar enough that neither of us noticed the subtle changes happening around us. The birds gradually stopped singing. The breeze grew cooler beneath the thicker canopy. The path beneath our boots became softer from recent rain, and the footprints of other hikers slowly disappeared until only our own remained pressed into the damp earth. It was Ethan who finally slowed to a stop. He unfolded the map again, studying it with unusual concentration before turning it in a complete circle. "This does not make much sense," he admitted quietly. "According to this, we should have crossed a small creek 15 minutes ago." I looked around. Every direction seemed identical. Massive Douglas fir trees surrounded us on all sides, their trunks rising like ancient pillars into a ceiling of green that blocked much of the afternoon sky. "Maybe we missed it," I suggested. Ethan shook his head slowly. "A creek is not exactly easy to miss." We stood there for several seconds, listening. There was no rushing water, no distant voices, no signs pointing toward another trail, only the quiet rustling of leaves somewhere high above us. "Let us head back to the fork," I said. "If we took the wrong trail, we can still fix it." Ethan agreed immediately, and we retraced our steps with growing determination. At first, the walk felt reassuring because we believed we knew exactly where we had come from. But after nearly 40 minutes, the familiar fork never appeared. Instead, every bend revealed another stretch of unfamiliar forest that looked almost identical to the last one. I stopped walking. "Ethan." He turned toward me. I did not have to finish the sentence. The expression on his face told me he had reached the same conclusion. We were no longer taking a simple detour. We had lost the trail completely. Instinctively, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen showed no signal. Ethan checked his own device with the same result before slipping it back into his jacket. He remained calmer than I expected. "We still have food, water, and daylight," he said in a steady voice. "Panicking now will only make things worse." His calmness slowed my racing thoughts. Ethan had always been that kind of person. Even when life became uncertain, he somehow carried himself with quiet confidence that encouraged everyone around him to breathe a little easier. We chose a single direction and continued walking carefully, paying close attention to anything that might help us retrace our route later. Ethan pointed out unusual landmarks as we passed them, including a cedar tree split cleanly down the middle by lightning years earlier and an enormous moss-covered boulder shaped almost like the bow of an old ship. Every few minutes we stopped to listen for water or distant voices, but the forest answered only with silence. Then the weather changed. Gray clouds drifted across the mountains, darkening the forest floor far earlier than expected. A cool wind swept between the trees, carrying the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. Within minutes, the first drops began falling through the branches above us. Ethan quickly pulled waterproof covers over both backpacks, while I searched for somewhere we could wait out the storm. We eventually found shelter beneath the thick branches of several enormous fir trees, where the rain reached us only in scattered droplets. Sitting side by side on a fallen log, we watched the rain gradually grow heavier until a silver curtain hid the forest beyond. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence no longer felt comfortable. It felt as though the wilderness itself had quietly closed every path behind us, leaving only the unknown stretching ahead. And for the first time since we had started this journey, I caught Ethan staring into the rain with an expression that looked less like worry and more like someone carrying a secret that had become far too heavy to keep hidden much longer. The rain finally softened just as the last light of the afternoon disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the forest wrapped in a cool gray silence that felt almost unreal. Water dripped steadily from the towering Douglas fir branches while a thin layer of mist drifted between the trees, blurring everything beyond a few dozen feet. Ethan stood first, brushing wet pine needles from his hiking pants before offering me his hand. I accepted it without thinking, the way I had hundreds of times before, yet something about the brief warmth of his grip lingered in my mind longer than it should have. We both knew continuing to wander after sunset would only increase the risk of becoming even more disoriented. So our first priority became finding a safe place to spend the night. After another 20 minutes of slow, careful walking, we discovered a small clearing surrounded by enormous evergreen trees whose thick branches blocked most of the lingering rain. The ground beneath them remained surprisingly dry, making it the safest place we had seen all afternoon. Together we unpacked the small emergency supplies Ethan always insisted on carrying during every hiking trip. While I collected dry twigs and fallen branches, Ethan carefully built a modest campfire using waterproof matches he had packed without ever mentioning them. Within minutes, a warm orange glow pushed back the growing darkness, and for the first time since realizing we were lost, I felt my shoulders relax. We shared the last of our sandwiches, divided our remaining snacks, and quietly discussed how much water we still had. The conversation stayed practical because practical subjects were easier than acknowledging the uncertainty waiting for us beyond the circle of firelight. As darkness settled over the forest, the sounds around us slowly changed. Daytime birds disappeared, replaced by distant owls and the gentle rustling of wind moving through thousands of pine needles high above. We had spent countless evenings camping together over the years, yet this silence felt different. It seemed to ask questions neither of us was prepared to answer. Ethan sat across from me, absent-mindedly stirring the fire with a long stick before breaking the silence. "Do you remember sophomore year when you broke your ankle during basketball season?" I laughed quietly. I remember being embarrassed because half the school watched me fall. Ethan smiled softly. "That is not the part one remember." I looked up. "What do you remember?" He shrugged as though the answer were unimportant. "I remember staying at the hospital until almost 3 in the morning because your parents were driving back from Portland, and I did not want you sitting there alone." I stared at him. "You never told me that." There never seemed to be a reason. His answer stayed with me as more forgotten memories slowly surfaced. Ethan remembered exactly how I liked my coffee when we first started working summer jobs after high school. He remembered the birthday gift I had wanted when I turned 16 but never received. He remembered the day my grandfather passed away, the old fishing spot where my father taught me to cast a line, even the first hiking trail we had ever completed together. None of those memories seemed remarkable on their own, yet hearing them one after another made something quietly shift inside me. I realized Ethan remembered details about my life that even I had forgotten. I studied him across the firelight, watching the flickering flames reflect in his blue eyes. "You remember everything," I said almost in disbelief. He smiled, but there was sadness hidden behind it. "Only the things that matter." Before I could ask what he meant, a cool gust of wind swept through the clearing, making the flames dance wildly. Ethan immediately stood, adjusted the small tarp we had stretched between two trees, and made certain my sleeping area stayed completely protected from the damp breeze before checking his own. It was such a small gesture that another person might never have noticed it. But sitting there surrounded by endless forest, I suddenly remembered dozens of moments stretching back across 15 years when Ethan had quietly done exactly the same thing in different ways, always making certain I was comfortable before thinking about himself. And for the very first time, I found myself wondering whether I had misunderstood the meaning of all those ordinary moments for far longer than either of us had ever realized. Morning arrived quietly beneath a blanket of low clouds, and for a few peaceful seconds, I almost forgot where we were. The small campfire had faded into glowing embers. Birds had begun singing somewhere high above the trees, and the cool scent of pine drifted through the clearing as though the forest wanted us to believe everything was normal again. Ethan was already awake, kneeling beside the fire while carefully heating water for instant coffee with the tiny camping stove he always packed even when I insisted we would never need it. He looked up and smiled the moment he noticed I was awake. "Good morning," he said. "I figured coffee might improve our chances of making smart decisions." I accepted the steaming cup with grateful hands. "I should probably stop making fun of how overprepared you are." He laughed softly. "That would ruin one of your favorite hobbies." For a little while, things almost felt familiar again. We shared breakfast, packed our gear, and agreed on a simple plan. Instead of wandering randomly, we would continue moving downhill, because streams often led toward roads, campsites, or ranger stations. It was the most logical choice we had, and logic felt comforting when everything else remained uncertain. The first hour passed without incident. Sunlight occasionally broke through the clouds, illuminating patches of vibrant green moss covering enormous boulders and fallen trees. We even found a narrow stream winding through the forest, giving us fresh water and renewed hope that we were finally heading in the right direction. Ethan seemed more relaxed than he had the previous afternoon, occasionally making the same terrible jokes that had somehow entertained me since middle school. Hearing him laugh made the forest seem a little less intimidating. Then the trail changed. Recent rain had transformed part of the hillside into soft mud hidden beneath a thick layer of fallen leaves. I stepped forward without noticing how unstable the ground had become. My right foot slipped unexpectedly, and before I could regain my balance, I felt myself sliding several feet down the muddy incline toward a cluster of wet rocks below. It was not a steep drop, but it was enough to send my heart racing. Before I could react, Ethan lunged toward me without hesitation. He caught the shoulder strap of my backpack with both hands and planted his boots firmly against a nearby tree root, stopping my slide almost instantly. The sudden movement threw him off balance as well, and he landed awkwardly on one knee while refusing to loosen his grip until he knew I was safe. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. I finally pulled myself back onto stable ground and turned toward him. "Are you all right?" I asked immediately. Ethan took a slow breath before standing. He rolled his left shoulder once, then forced an easy smile. "I am fine." It was the same smile he used whenever he wanted to hide discomfort, and after knowing him for 15 years, I recognized it instantly. "Your shoulder," I said. "You landed hard. It will be sore for a day or two. Nothing more." He answered so casually that another person might have believed him. I did not. As we continued walking, I noticed him quietly adjusting the weight of his backpack onto his other side. Whenever he thought I was not looking, every few minutes he stretched his arm as though trying to loosen stiff muscles before pretending nothing had happened. Guilt settled heavily inside me. "You should have let me catch myself," I said after we stopped beside the stream to refill our water bottles. Ethan looked at me with complete sincerity. That was never an option. His answer came so naturally that it almost stole my breath. There was no hesitation, no dramatic pause, just simple certainty, as though protecting me had never been a decision he needed to think about. Sitting beside the flowing water while sunlight reflected across its surface, I found myself replaying countless memories from the previous 15 years. Every time he had quietly carried the heavier backpack, every time he had walked closest to traffic on busy streets, every unexpected cup of coffee he had brought to my workshop during long projects, every ordinary act of kindness I had accepted without ever wondering why. For the first time in my life, those memories no longer looked like random gestures from a loyal friend. They looked like pieces of a truth that had been patiently waiting for me to see it all along. By late afternoon, the stream curved toward a rocky hillside where the forest grew thicker and quieter than anywhere we had walked before. The sunlight faded behind another layer of gathering clouds, turning the towering evergreens into dark silhouettes against a pale gray sky. Ethan stopped beside the water and looked upward. "Another storm," he said calmly. "We should find shelter before it reaches us." We continued following the stream until we discovered a shallow rock overhang tucked into the hillside. It was not large enough to be comfortable, but it offered protection from the wind and the rain that began falling only a few minutes after we settled inside. Water rolled down the stone walls outside while the steady rhythm of rain echoed through the small shelter, creating the strange feeling that the rest of the world had quietly disappeared. We unpacked what little food remained and divided everything evenly without needing to discuss it. This time, when Ethan instinctively tried to hand me the larger portion, I smiled and pushed half of it back toward him. "We are sharing everything," I said. "No more pretending you are less hungry than I am." He looked at me for a moment before giving a small laugh. "You finally caught on." We ate slowly while the lantern resting between us filled the shelter with warm amber light. Beyond the entrance, the rain blurred the forest into soft shapes that seemed almost unreal. There were no ringing phones, no passing cars, no deadlines, no distractions. Just two lifelong friends sitting together with nowhere left to go except into a conversation both of us had been avoiding for years. Ethan rested his back against the stone wall and stared quietly at the falling rain. "Do you remember when I turned down that engineering job in Denver last year?" he asked. I nodded. "You told me the timing was wrong." He smiled faintly. "That was only part of the truth." I waited without interrupting. "There have been a lot of decisions in my life that probably looked strange from the outside," he continued. "Jobs I never accepted, places I never moved, relationships that never became serious. Everyone thought I was afraid of commitment or too comfortable staying in Cedar Ridge." He paused, drawing a slow breath before looking toward me for the first time since the conversation began. "The truth is much simpler than that." My heartbeat quickened even though I still did not know what he was about to say. Ethan's voice remained steady, almost peaceful, as though carrying this secret for so many years had exhausted him. "Sometimes you spend so much time protecting one important relationship that you quietly sacrifice every other possibility without even realizing it. I kept believing that if I waited long enough, everything inside me would eventually change." He let out a soft laugh that carried no humor. It never did. The rain grew heavier outside, drumming gently against the rocks above us while silence settled between every sentence. I searched his face and suddenly remembered every thoughtful gesture from the past 15 years. Every moment, he had somehow appeared exactly when I needed someone beside me. "Seattle was supposed to be my fresh start," he admitted. "I thought putting 300 miles between us might finally help me become the person everyone expected me to be." He lowered his eyes for a moment before continuing. "Then you agreed to come on this hiking trip, and I realized I did not want to leave without at least being honest once in my life." He looked directly into my eyes, not with fear or expectation, but with the quiet courage of someone who had already accepted whatever answer might come next. My mind searched for words that refused to appear. The forest outside had trapped us physically, yet somehow the silence inside that small shelter had begun removing every wall we had ever built between us. I could feel that we were standing at the edge of a moment that would change both of our lives forever, even though neither of us had spoken the final truth aloud yet. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. The steady rhythm of rain against the rocks filled the silence, while the warm lantern between us cast gentle shadows across the shelter walls. Ethan did not look away. He simply waited with the quiet patience that had always been part of who he was. There was no pressure in his expression, no expectation that I would immediately understand what he had spent years trying to hide. I searched for something to say, but every memory from the past 15 years seemed to arrive at once. The countless mornings he had shown up with coffee outside my workshop without asking if I needed company. The afternoons he volunteered to help me finish impossible projects. The holidays he somehow spent with my family whenever mine felt too small. The endless road trips, camping weekends, late-night conversations, and ordinary Tuesdays that suddenly looked completely different through the truth he had begun to reveal. Finally, I found my voice. "Ethan," I said quietly, "what are you really trying to tell me?" He lowered his eyes for only a second before letting out a slow breath that sounded as though it had been trapped inside him for years. When he looked back at me, there was no hesitation left. "I never wanted to lose my best friend," he said. Softly, "That fear has been stronger than anything else for a very long time. Every time I thought about telling you the truth, I imagined watching you pull away from me, and I realized I would rather keep my feelings to myself than lose the person who has meant the most to me since we were kids." His voice remained calm, yet every word carried years of quiet honesty. "Somewhere along the way," he continued, "you stopped being just my closest friend. I cannot even tell you exactly when it happened. Maybe it was after one of those camping trips. Maybe it was after graduation. Maybe it was one ordinary afternoon that neither of us even remembers. All I know is that one day I realized my favorite place had never really been a location. It had become wherever you happened to be." I felt my heart beating harder with every sentence. Ethan offered a small, uncertain smile before continuing. "I have loved you for years, Noah. I kept waiting for those feelings to disappear because I thought they made life more complicated than it needed to be. Everyone says time changes people. Time changed almost everything except that." He paused, looking toward the rain beyond the shelter entrance. "When I accepted the job in Seattle, I honestly believed distance would help me move forward. I thought leaving Cedar Ridge might finally allow me to let go of something I had never asked for in the first place. But when you agreed to come on this trip, I realized I could not leave without at least being honest once. I never planned for us to become lost out here, but somehow this forest took away every excuse I had left. He laughed quietly, embarrassed more than anything else. You do not have to say anything tonight. You do not owe me an answer. When we find our way home, you can pretend this conversation never happened if that makes life easier for you. I meant every word, but I also mean this. Being your friend has always been the greatest privilege of my life, and I will never regret that. His kindness somehow made everything even harder to process. I looked at him across the lantern light, realizing he had just entrusted me with the most vulnerable part of himself without asking for anything in return. I opened my mouth several times, searching desperately for the right words, but none of them felt large enough for what I was feeling. Instead, I simply held his gaze, overwhelmed by the growing realization that my silence no longer came from confusion. It came from the frightening possibility that somewhere beneath years of unquestioned friendship, my own heart had quietly begun walking toward the same truth long before I was ready to admit it. Morning arrived with unexpected calm. The rain had stopped sometime before sunrise, leaving thousands of tiny droplets clinging to every pine needle and fern around the shelter. Soft golden light filtered through the trees, transforming the damp forest into something almost magical. For a brief moment, it was difficult to believe that only a few hours earlier my entire understanding of my own life had been turned upside down. Ethan was already awake when I opened my eyes. He quietly packed our gear, careful not to disturb me, moving with the same steady patience that had always defined him. When he noticed I was awake, he smiled politely, but I immediately recognized the subtle distance he had placed between us. He was honoring the promise he had made the night before. He was giving me space, refusing to pressure me for an answer I was not yet ready to give. We left the shelter shortly after sunrise and continued following the narrow stream that had guided us since the previous afternoon. Neither of us mentioned his confession. Instead, we focused on practical things. We discussed which direction the water seemed to flow, how much food remained in our backpacks, and whether the clouds suggested another storm later in the day. The conversation was simple, almost ordinary, but every quiet moment between those sentences carried new meaning. I found myself watching Ethan more carefully than ever before. Every time the trail became uneven, he instinctively slowed his pace until I caught up. Whenever low branches blocked the path, he gently held them aside so they would not swing back toward me. When we stopped to refill our water bottles, he handed me mine before opening his own. None of those gestures were new. The difference was that I finally understood them. Around mid-morning, we heard a sound that immediately stopped both of us. At first, it was so faint I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, distant and mechanical, echoing through the valley beyond the trees. Ethan looked toward the sound at the exact same moment I did. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I nodded. "It sounds like an engine." Hope returned almost instantly. We climbed a gentle rise beside the stream and called out together as loudly as we could. The forest swallowed our voices, then fell silent again. A few seconds later, another voice answered somewhere beyond the trees. We called again, louder this time. Within minutes, 2 search and rescue volunteers wearing bright orange jackets appeared through the forest, smiling with obvious relief the moment they saw us. One of them explained that a park ranger had noticed Ethan's pickup truck still parked at the trailhead after the storm rolled through, and when neither of us returned home, our families reported us missing early that morning. After checking that we were tired but otherwise healthy, they guided us toward an access road where another rescue vehicle waited. The drive back to Cedar Ridge passed in a blur. Familiar roads, small businesses, and mountain homes slowly replaced endless trees until everything looked exactly as it had before our trip. Yet nothing inside me felt the same anymore. During the following week, life quietly returned to its usual routine. I reopened my woodworking shop. Ethan continued preparing for his move to Seattle. We still met for coffee, still exchanged messages, and still laughed together. But beneath every ordinary conversation, another one remained unfinished. Then one evening, after closing my workshop, I noticed an old photograph hanging beside my workbench. Ethan and I stood shoulder to shoulder after a camping trip years earlier, both covered in mud, smiling as though the future could never separate us. I stared at that picture for a long time before a simple realization settled into my heart. The emptiness I had felt when Ethan accepted the Seattle job had never been about losing my best friend to another city. It had been about imagining a future where the first person I wanted to call after every good day, every bad day, and every ordinary moment would no longer be beside me. Somewhere between getting lost in the forest and finding our way home, I had stopped asking whether Ethan loved me. The only question that still mattered was why it had taken me so many years to recognize that my own heart had quietly been searching for him all along. The morning Ethan was supposed to leave for Seattle arrived with the quiet certainty that always seems to accompany life-changing moments. His blue pickup truck sat in the driveway with neatly packed boxes secured beneath a weatherproof cover, and the familiar house where I had spent countless weekends over the past 15 years suddenly looked different because I knew everything was about to change. Ethan smiled when he saw me walking toward him, but there was a gentle restraint in that smile, as though he had already prepared himself for whatever future I chose. "I was hoping I would see you before I left," he said softly. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. "I need you to do one last thing with me before you go." He looked surprised, but did not ask any questions. All right. Less than an hour later, we were back at the Pine Hollow trailhead. The parking lot looked peaceful beneath a cloudless blue sky, and warm afternoon sunlight filtered through the same towering Douglas fir trees that had witnessed the most important conversation of our lives only days earlier. This time the forest did not feel frightening. It felt familiar again, almost welcoming us back. We followed the main trail in comfortable silence until we reached the overlook where we had stopped for lunch before taking the wrong path. Endless green mountains stretched across the horizon, while a gentle breeze carried the fresh scent of pine through the warm afternoon air. Ethan rested both hands on the wooden railing and looked across the valley. "I never thought I would come back here so soon," he admitted. "Neither did I answered. "But I think this is exactly where we needed to be." He turned toward me, his expression calm and patient, giving me the same kindness he had shown throughout our entire friendship. "Have you figured out what you wanted to say?" he asked quietly. I took a slow breath. I had spent the entire week searching for perfect words, but standing there beside him, I realized perfect words had never been the reason we understood each other. Honesty had always been enough. "When you told me how you felt," I began, "I thought I needed time because I was confused. The truth is, I was never confused. I was afraid." Ethan remained silent, allowing me to continue without interruption. "I kept telling myself that I only did not want you to move because I was losing my best friend. Then I started paying attention to every ordinary moment that had always mattered more than I realized. Every time something good happened, you were the first person I wanted to call. Every difficult day became easier the moment you showed up. Every tradition, every road trip, every birthday, every quiet weekend somehow felt complete because you were there." I smiled, feeling years of uncertainty quietly disappear. "You told me that somewhere along the way your favorite place became wherever I happened to be. I finally understand what you meant because I realized the exact same thing happened to me. I simply recognized it much later than you did." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief second before looking back at me, and I could see hope returning to his expression. I stepped closer until we stood only a few feet apart. "If you still want to move to Seattle, I will support you because your dreams matter to me. But I do not want either of us to spend another day pretending this is only friendship when my heart has already given me a different answer." I reached forward and gently took his hand. The gesture felt astonishingly natural, as though it had been waiting for us all along. "I do not want us to be only best friends anymore." Ethan smiled through quiet emotion, his familiar crooked grin somehow brighter than I had ever seen it. Neither of us needed elaborate promises because our story had already been built through 15 years of trust, loyalty, and countless ordinary moments that quietly became extraordinary. We stood together overlooking the endless forest where we had once believed we were completely lost, realizing that the greatest discovery had never been the trail leading home. It had been finding the courage to recognize that the person who had walked beside us through every season of life had always been home from the very beginning. And together we stepped away from the overlook toward whatever future waited ahead, no longer as two friends searching for different paths, but as two hearts finally choosing the same one.